Now, we've seen mayors and city police commissioners in all sorts of cities responding to assaults and critiques. Most recently, Mayor Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, but we're hearing it from everyone. What are you making of the kind of responses that you're hearing so far?
Well, many of them are very negative. They identify what they don't want. Mm-hmm. They want to reduce the excessive use of force. Very often, though, they talk on the side. We want to instill community trust. But if you look at what they measure tends to be arrest, summonses, stops. They also will look at reports, which aren't always made, of excessive force. But there are no measures of community trust. There are very few measures of de-escalation, which is identified as a way to avoid excessive force. So if I could suggest, we would actually try to identify what we want police to do in a positive sense, and then go ahead and use the adage, we treasure what we measure.
Well said. I could not say it better. I had a conversation, two conversations that really stand out for me. I had a conversation with the mayor a year and a half ago, and later another version of that conversation with the now police commissioner, who's a friend, and I think has a good heart, and the different responses. There's a distrust between police and public and police. Mm-hmm. And that is built into the culture.
We should say you have been on both sides of that.
Yes.
And you wrote about your own experience at the hands of the police when you were 15. And
yes.
then you served for whatever it was, 22
years. And we need to erode that distrust. And that distrust must be a built-in measuring tool. How do we promote? How do we decide who's going to be a precinct commander? How do we give rank? Police should be out there every day. We have a municipal ID program. That cop should be on the corner handing out those forms, telling someone that, listen, you know what, we have a municipal ID program, be a part of it. The mother who goes in the subway station should be able to say, Officer Johnson, I heard your son just graduated. Congratulations. And yes, Ms. Jones, I heard your daughter just had a baby. That's the relationship, because you know what happens with that communication? That's the same mother who's going to stop and say, there's a person who's selling guns in my building. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the relationship that developed. Bad guys talk. The good guys have this wall that they've been divided from each other. And we need to, I never thought I would borrow from Ronald Reagan, but we need to tear down that wall.
But Donna, I mean, we've heard from people on this program before, particularly some of the folks involved in the Say Her Name, Black Lives Matter campaigns. Across the country, there are whole neighborhoods where people are not going to call the police because their experience is that leads to an escalation and often, especially in the case of women of color, sometimes fatalities. We've talked about them on the show. So how do you start turning some of that stuff around?
Well, I think that Eric makes a good point. The police, you know, sort of starting perhaps with the Giuliani era, where instead of focusing on neighborhood policing, community policing, and that can mean a whole lot of different things depending on who's saying it, but policing that's based on relationships and respect. You know, the notion of, you know, serve the community, not, you know, hammer and occupy the community. So I think if we replace those SWAT teams and the SWAT team mentality with neighborhood policing, where people are in the communities, you know, day in, day out, and have a reason to and have a basis to develop relationships, it's like a whole other story.
And just going back, Judy, to the conversation about where cops live and where they come from, I think what I'm hearing from you is a bit more sophisticated than that.
Well, I think, you know, the examples that both of you give about interactions in the community, if you really want that, you really want the officer to say, oh, Miss Jones, I see, you know, your daughter's graduated, and has she heard about such and such a program, right? Because one of the measures of community policing that I've suggested is called positive interaction.
So you'd actually measure that?
Yes. And so both Donna and Eric have actually been in favor of using body cameras. Body cameras have very often been used to identify the negative, but as Donna said, they can be used in a positive way to identify the positive.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
So if you use a body camera, you could actually have the officer be on record as starting a conversation, just like Eric has talked about, and at the same time sharing something about himself or herself so that it's an interaction. So then you would have dialogue between individuals about meaningful things.
The problem we're having in policing is that if you were to look at the men and women who lead the policies and police practices, they were police officers during the most horrific crime pattern years, during the 80s, during the late, some even back to the 70s. The mindset of something as foreign as saying good morning to someone walking on the block is like, are you kidding me? You know, we don't do this. We're not social workers. We go after bad guys. That is the problem. Some of these young cops I see who were the victims of aggressive policing, who want to build bridges, they are having impediments in doing so. We met a group of young officers in the 9-0 precinct who are spending their time going out and going to young people who had negative interactions and talking to them and grooming and developing these relationships. And just the obstacles are with the problem. These policy makers are in the way of changing the paradigm of the effective